Hello everyone, and welcome to the last session of today and the last session of the conference. The topic of this session will be many phases of the debate between naturalism and supernaturalism. And our first speaker will be Marcin Podbielski from Ignatianum University in Cracow, and he will be talking about Newton between Hermes and Plotinus, a nature that is not and also is God. Please take the stage.
The official title of my presentation is Newton between Hermes and Plotinus, a nature that is not and also is God. However, today I decided, viewing how loosely people do use the term naturalism, that I can simply say Newton's God and paganism of scientific naturalist explanation. And further on, I believe I can say it with quite a certitude, because there is a definition of paganism within our long tradition that actually made by pagans themselves, that actually matches quite a lot of what would like naturalist approach. I'm not a specialist in science. My specialty is late ancient and early Christian philosophy. So all of that, what I'm saying, is an encroachment onto a territory on which I do not work normally, except for teaching some classes. And in this encroachment, I ask the very same questions that people in antiquity, especially early Christians, asked. These are questions of existence. These are the questions I was taught by them to ask. And asking this question, I invite you into a travel into the problem of scientific explanation, which can be, naturalist explanation can be defined as the problem of immanent causality. This problem of immanent causality, causality present within the world, is something that constructs science, because at the very outset of its existence, when we stopped having philosophy of nature and started having Philosophia Experimentalis of Newton, a new idea of how to account for causes was brought in, precisely by Newton. So Newton is the focal point of this discussion, and the background of this discussion, the focal issue in those discussion is the notion of discontinuous causality. Newton the focal point, discontinuous causality the focal issue, and the background is a broadly Hermetic inspiration in which he relied on. The Hermetic inspiration is the inspiration of the Hermeticism, of the ancient and early medieval Hermeticism, and these are texts he actually read, as confirmed by studies of Betty Jo Dobbs. He did comment quite a lot on Hermetics. He read later texts, and I suppose he could read also earlier texts. And he chose, in his construction of science, he chose one of possibilities present in the Hermeticism, rejecting another one, and also rejecting a kind of Christian approach to scientific explanation. But before then, I would like to introduce this crucial point of discontinuity and discontinuous causality. Be jumping over it, because this point is best explained by people to whom we can devote very little attention today. These are actually postmodern authors who can be thought of as kinds of deconstructivists of science, but they do ask the question of existence, which is important. Foucault does ask the question of existence of things like forces or beings that are created through kinds of universal forms and accepted in science. He does ask it, and in his very first book, the major philosophical book, which is translated in English as The Order of Things, Les mots et les choses, In this book, he does point out to establishment of such being in science in order to deal with discontinuity. His question is the question of existence of objects science speaks about. And the continuous reality of science of 17th century is suddenly destroyed in 18th and 19th century because disparate facts are accounted for. Disparate facts of value, disparate facts of biology. Like we had a continuity of animal, bee and plant world in Linnaeus, each of them having another and another feature in the continuous world of possible properties. Suddenly, in late 18th century, they realize that there is no continuity when we look for organic structures. Organic structures are discontinuous and parallel and similar in different parts of this creating living world. And Foucault interprets this as introduction of kind of all-encompassing form, transcendent form of life, which allows the researcher or the scientist to analyze organicity, analyze structures, compare them, and later on also to propose evolution. Life, evolution, organism, all these are kinds of being created or established or accepted in science, and these are the proper objects science discusses, at least since early 19th century. He does 3 or 4 analyses like that, and then realizes it's also human being, as in science, as discussed in early modern science, is a kind of both transcendental category that allows for all experiences to be unified, and also a product, a being that is established through those categories. And his object is to get rid of this absurdity of being both a source and a product. Still, what is important for us is that he thinks this can be overcome, at least in this point, that this is proper for science to establish such continuous beings that allow for continuity of reality in discontinuous experience. However, a much more advanced, a much later critic, postmodern critic or sociologist of science, turned critic of science and reconstructor of science, Bruno Latour, he decided in his last book that this is right, that discontinuity is what is here, and science deals with discontinuity by, in a way, reduplicating the world. And this reduplication of the world can be either correct or erroneous. On the one hand, we have separate experiences, and then science has separate facts it creates, like laboratory settings in which it examines living beings. Then it deals with separate transformation of this material, like results of chemical analysis, probe sheets on which those results show themselves, probe sheets comparing these results with standards, results of those analyses, and at the very, very end, also some generalizations in the form of laws. All of that is an incessant process of transformation, which we start not from reality, but from primary data, jump over hiatus in every research process, and end up with a kind of framework, referential framework, in which discontinuity is being overcome all the time. This process is for him the reality he calls reference. So we have referential beings, which science discusses and explains. Referential beings which exist as other, not as beings, and are discussed by science. There are 15 domains of reality, ontological domains of reality like that. Religion, technique, morality, also kinds of transformational pieces of our world, the world the moderns live, beings as other. And next to them, there is something we purportedly studied. The world, not in itself, the world of reproduction, which jumps over the existential hiatus all the time, like a kind of proto-Heraclitean nature. There is still no nature. Latour believes that this discontinuity is proper to the world itself. And while his language is very unclear, this is absolutely clear. Discontinuity for him is a part of this world. And this is what science deals with, moving us from this discontinuity of this world to the quasi-continuous reality of beings of reference. And when reflecting on Latour, at a certain moment I realized that this discontinuity is something that science struggles with all the time. And I realized that the person who dealt with that, who first introduced forces, powers, forces of nature that move one thing into another and come over, was Newton. So I went to him and found out things absolutely wondrous, quite different from what I supposed. In very short texts that precede and end his Principia, and also in a manuscript he wrote in a very early age. The manuscript is titled De Gravitatione, and which provides a kind of tentative philosophical background for his Philosophia Experimentalis. What Newton does, in my opinion, is recognizing discontinuity of nature as the condition, as fact, and as a condition of science, and as a condition of scientific explanation. In the age of 20 or 23, Newton attacks in De Gravitate, Newton attacks Descartes. Descartes is probably the last person to explain the world through continuous causation. So, as Aristotle, for instance, explained physical change through so-called mechanism of potentiality and actuality, he assumed that the very same being, for instance, a piece of fire, is being overcome from within by the form of water that comes to it. It is inside being itself, inside a substantial piece of fire that change occurs, and continuity is assured by presence of primary matter. Similarly, in some respects, Descartes believes that there must be continuity of causality, at least in form of touching of surfaces. So he does accept that surface is shared by two bodies. And he believes that the universe is a kind of big, great river of ether with Earth in the very center, and every piece moving according to its own substantial motion, and also having many apparent motions. So planets have their own proper circular motion, gyrating motions, but they also apparent motion within this gyration or rotation of the ether. And everything must touch everything else and share also a part of its existence by sharing surface in order for things to move. Newton has lots of factual problems with that, show how Descartes in the Principia is factually wrong about the motions of parts of the universe. The greatest problem that arises in that era are comets. Comets cannot exist according to Descartes. They cannot traverse space freely, moving on elliptical, traverse the the ecliptic of planets move through the level of planets. It's impossible for him. They should be moving in kinds of whirlpools within this great gyration. Newton decides at this very early age that he must get rid of Descartes' notion of space, which is associated with the substance of bodies. A substance of the body creates space. That he needs a new ontological account of what space is and what of body is in order to explain causality he deals with. So, first, he believes that space is separate from bodies. It's objective. He introduces this absolute space, but even non-absolute space is objective in the sense it differs from bodies. And space is numerically individuated. This allows for every motion to be relative to space, but it also allows for every body to be different numerically, to be individuated numerically, as he says, by being differently placed within the space, within space as such. Every body is individuated, it's a different being, thanks to being in different pieces of space, and each piece of space is numerically different and they cannot be interchanged. This is his big idea behind everything else. But this means that he needs, at this point, to assume that every causality is discontinuous. Because when a body strikes a body in Newton, they don't share a surface. One body loses its force according to laws of nature. Another body gets its motion and also acts with force of inertia. And force of inertia is real force and real property of that body. Ultimately, there is gravity, which is proportional to the mass of each body, i.e. to the quantity of matter, and inversely proportional to the square of distance between bodies. Bodies act in separation. Bodies act discontinuously. And causality of gravity is discontinuous. And causality of forces is always discontinuous. Only then can Newton explain the world as it looks like. Only then can he propose laws that apply to a feather and a stone falling in what he calls Boylean vacuum, and also to planets. And only then can he explain and predict the motion of comets. The motion of comets, this final corollary, which makes his system true, is the pre-final piece of Principia. The final piece of Principia is an attempt to explain that. How is it possible? How such causality is possible? And his basic attitude is to say, I don't know. I don't know what is gravity. I cannot explain it. Maybe one day I will. On the other hand, this is the last page of the Principia. On the two penultimate pages, however, he says that he prefers the notion that God acts himself, that God does it, that God is the cause of this motion. And what we called gravity is actually mathematical regularity with which God acts. He also says that he doesn't like another explanation, that there would be something called the soul of the universe, this Platonic and Neoplatonic soul of the universe, that he must get rid of that, and he doesn't say why. Interestingly, there are reasons spelled out for all of that in De Gravitatione and in the Hermetic texts. And he dearly, doubtlessly read Hermetic texts. In De Gravitatione, he proposes a deeper explanation, in which God plays battleships. He marks a piece of space as impenetrable, and this becomes body and mass. Then he transfers this property of impenetrability to next apparently contiguous piece of space. And this is what motion works like. He says still that it is like an act of imagining what motion is like. Let me imagine that. I don't say these are bodies. Direct action of God is like his will acting regularly. And also he rejects firmly in the Gravitatione the notion of the soul of the universe. And this notion may be rejected for religious reasons. We are in a specific situation. Let me go back for a second. We're in a very specific situation in which his Philosophy Experimentalis is a descriptive approach. He cannot say what gravitation is. He provides mathematical laws. He derives phenomena from mathematical laws. He derives those mathematically expressed laws from the phenomena, and then he derives phenomena from those mathematical laws. It's like a description. On the other hand, he says, but gravity is real. Gravity is not description. I am not speaking about something that doesn't exist. He cannot accept that he's speaking about beings of reference or is speaking about descriptions. So he needs reality. And behind the scenes, in his alchemic writings, he looks for an intermediary power. And this intermediary power is strange. It's very close not to the soul of the universe, but to the Hermetic God. Because if this were the soul of the universe, it would end up to be a minor deity, like it is in Plotinus. In Plotinus, in the treatise on the motion of the heavens, you can see how soul is dependent on higher gods as moving the universe around the central, and how this soul of the universe is also worshipped as a divinity by stars. This is like a spiritual power on its own. And Newton is monotheist. So he ends up with a broadly hermetic vision of God, similar to Treatise 11, especially Treatise 14, and for the major author on Hermeticism and alchemy in Newton, Betty Dobbs does not analyze those treatises, but I see enormous similarities. Thus, that Hermetic God is both transcendent, one, and is also immanent through his activity and actions, and the world is his body. So it sounds very similar to the idea proposed by Newton in the Gravitatione that space is something like emanative product of God. Like his body. Motions are like his motions. We have one option. We don't explain. We say we're the referential world. We don't say that gravity is real. Another, we say gravity is real, then it's either action of God or it's a minor divinity. And actually, if we say that, it's very hard not to conclude that it's minor divinity created out of our minds, out of projection of our analysis. And then we end up in a definition of divinity created or carved by humans, such as is proposed by yet another treatise belonging to the Hermetic corpus, by the Asclepius. In chapter 23 and 24 of the Asclepius, the anonymous author, how to say it, the anonymous author is worried about Egypt, which is becoming impious. Foreigners will come and will destroy its piety, its multiplicity of gods. All those gods are created by humans. As first God is poietes or effector of God. Humans are fictores deorum, carvers of gods. And those gods who live in temples, on the other one hand are material, on the other hand share in human spirituality. So, those gods do prophesize, do predict future, cure people, give joy and sorrow, and they are still our creation. Actually, if we create forces like that, if our forces, if our fields are kinds of creation like that, with actually pieces of faith to which we gave being. And all those factors that make it possible to jump over this continuity of causality, all those factors we invented, we believe in, be it evolution, they act like those minor divinities described in Asclepius. They do predict future. They do give us comfort or sorrow, and more sorrow now than comfort. They do cure us much better than those Egyptian gods. If we can't stand within the distance, within the science, and say that we speak only about beings of reference, beings created by us in our minds, that we are really explaining reality, that we turn all those beings of science into kind of minor divinities that are both created by us and worshipped as if they were real forces of this world. And it's very hard to avoid this, simply and basically because we automatically treat beings as beings in themselves. So, if Latour says, I'm doing an ontology of being as other, we don't do it. And even if Newton says, I'm proposing mathematical philosophy, experimental philosophy, and I do something like description, he still says, gravity is being in itself, is treated as a being as being, it's not being as other, as showing to us. So either one is extremely cautious and doesn't become pagan, or one believes in science, believes in naturalist explanation, and can become a pagan, always in conflict with Christianity or with Newton's Hermeticism, or we try to give a better metaphysical grounding for science, especially for discontinuous causality. Thank you.
Thank you very much.